Mr. Chair, the meeting is live.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us for this year's Days of Remembrance event. I am Michael Epstein, and I am the chair of the Human Rights and Relations Commission. We are a volunteer commission selected by the City of Edina City Council. We work with human rights issues within the City of Edina. This is our 11th annual Days of Remembrance, and we are thrilled that you are all here to join us to hear Eva Mourinho. Days of Remembrance is just one of the events that we hold as a commission, and I would encourage anybody who would like to learn more about our commission to visit the city's website and click on our link. To ask a question during the live question and answer session near the end of the program, participants may send an email to Heidi Lee at hlee, H-L-E-E, at edinamn.gov. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Mayor Jim Hoblin, who has been a huge supporter of not only Days of Remembrance, but of the Human Rights and Relations Commission in general. Mayor?
Thank you, Chair Epstein. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today, and of course to think about the fact that we're on the 11th Days of Remembrance is quite significant. You know, in Edina, we've got an ardent belief in the importance of the Days of Remembrance and the significance of it being an annual event. The concept of never forget is a critically important educational message we believe should be given yearly. We have all learned lessons for life in different ways, and Days of Remembrance is one of those opportunities to learn or reinforce those lessons learned through the stories that we've all been told. Many of our lessons learned through storytelling relate to how we treat each other, how welcoming we are, and how open we are to embracing and benefiting from people, knowing people different from us, in skin color, in religion, in culture, and even in habit. Here is yet another story for you to contemplate, and it's about me. I stood recently on what's called the Hill of Ill Advice in Jerusalem with 11 other mayors in late March this year, listening to comments from Aaron Lerman, former Deputy National Security Advisor for the State of Israel. The rolling hills of Jerusalem create a beautiful setting for this city of approximately 900,000 people, and the pronounced use of what is called Jerusalem stone gives the city a soft, rich, and beautiful countenance. In the distance, with Lerman's assistance, we could see the southern wall of the old city, the Golden Dome, the third holiest place in Islam, where Muhammad is said to have ascended to heaven, Mount Olive, where Jews want to be buried, and Mount Scopus, the home of the Hebrew University, which was clearly visible as well. For me, there was a warm, enveloping breeze in Israel that seemed special to this place. It's really quite difficult to explain. I first felt it as we sat at the Black Arrow Monument in southern Israel, the wire fencing marking the Gaza Strip visible in the distance, listening to a man called Alon Schuster, another former Israeli security advisor, talk about his aspirations for how life could be between Palestinians and Israelis and his desire to be the first consul general to Gaza. That breeze at both the Black Arrow Monument and again on the Hill of Ill Advice overlooking Jerusalem felt the same to me and enveloped me with the spirits of the ancients. 4,000 years of living seemed to drift over me. You could sense stories wanting to be told. You could feel the biblical life, travelers wandering with news to share, teachers imparting lessons, and always religion, all of it brushing by, sharing the history of tribes and peoples and asking me to be more curious, more patient, more knowledgeable, more understanding, and more giving of grace and the constant need to seek wisdom. In 1948, following the application of discrimination to people in its most evil form, resulting in the deaths of over 6 million Jewish people, a homeland was created for them under the most bittersweet of circumstances. 74 years later, the shadow of discrimination arguably appears to be cast over the Palestinians, their next-door neighbors. Israel, however, would argue the conflict is not about racism, but instead about self-determination and security. It is, no matter how characterized, a problem between people, who both deserve to exercise their collective identity. In our own country, we don't face conflict over self-determination and security. We see discrimination based upon race, and we see it based upon religion. One of our challenges is that racism has become overt due to agency being granted to those who claim racial superiority by those who recently led our country. Power is responsibility, said Tal Becker in a meeting we had with him. Tal Becker is an Israeli peace negotiator and author of the Abraham Accord. In our country, however, the power to guide and influence behavior was misplaced, misguided, and irresponsibly used for some period of time, and gave some people the confidence and assurance to openly express their views on racial superiority. We heard the superior race assertion before, about 80 years ago, and it led to a world war, the death of millions of people, and subsequent formation of a new democracy in the Middle East. The cost to establish this new country of Israel should have never had to have been paid by those millions of deaths. And it all started with microaggressions, which over several years turned into something the world had never before experienced. Not enough voices tried to end the escalating anger and scapegoating. We don't want that to be repeated and happen in our town, our state, or our country. So now is the time to not only be vigilant, but to be vocal to any evidence of racism. Don't let what may seem like foolish acts, such as mocking others different from ourselves, go without renouncement and rejection, no matter what the age of the perpetrators. Don't admire evil from other eras or the behavior of the people led by them. Be a critical thinker and an active voice. Remind people that no one should be judged by the color of their skin, their religion, or their ethnicity, and take all of us as we are. That's a maximum of humanity. Take us all as we are. So let that breeze from the cradle of civilization embrace you too, just as it did me, and model your behavior to lead by example. Be respectful, be considerate, be inclusive and welcoming. Be curious and do not judge or condemn. Give grace even when difficult, and be human. In other words, maybe, just maybe, we will get to where we all need to be and how we need to treat each other as members of the human race. Thank you, and I look forward to the presentation today.
Thank you, Mayor Jim. Steve Hunting's Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. And Mayor, thank you for your beautiful and heartfelt words from Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the Jewish people in the state of Israel, and a city so holy to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There should be ever peace there. And thank you for all your efforts to bring together peoples throughout the world, given your work now in Jerusalem and then all the way back home with us in Edina. I want to thank the City of Edina, Human Rights Commission, everybody involved, the mayor, Heidi, Michael, Scott, Dan, Francesca, Sabe, Jasmine. We've had a wonderful relationship over these years. Thinking back to last July when we gathered at the Edina City Hall to hear from Manny Gabler and his story of finding refuge in Shanghai, along with 15 or 20,000 Jews from primarily Germany, who, if they could make their way all the way to China, could survive the Shoah, the Holocaust. Edina, 11 years now committed to Days of Remembrance, joins a global community of commemoration. Just this year, I was telling the mayor, we were in Bismarck, North Dakota, the mayor's home state, for a commemoration of Holocaust of Bemidji, Bismarck State College, as well as the North Dakota National Guard. It was a remarkable event against the backdrop of the beautiful Missouri River from that heights in Bismarck, North Dakota. And we had Temple Israel. We had our Yom HaShoah commemoration a couple of days after that. So as I said, Edina is joining this global act of remembrance. And why do we remember? If you go to the United States Holocaust Memorials Museum, you see on the outside of the wall, a quote from General Eisenhower when he visited the Ohrdruf concentration camp on April 12th in 1945. And it says there in that quote, "Things I saw beggar description. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. Those words from the general we take deeply to heart, because we must remember, as Deborah Lipstadt, the eminent historian of the Holocaust, now the United States Special Emissary for Anti-Semitism in the State Department, says, unfortunately, never again has meant again and again and again. And in some ways, we just turn our eyes to the Ukraine and see what is happening there. And our hearts are, of course, with the brave people of Ukraine as they fight Russian aggression against their country and defend their democracy. We also think of, looking at Eva right now, stories of resistance, of hope, of determination in the face of the Holocaust, in the face of the Shoah. And we'll learn more about her story, her mom's story, and what that can teach us. There's a project that was conducted by the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto called the Shabbat Process, so-called name because they did their work on the Sabbath, on Saturday. And that was to chronicle the life that went on in the ghetto, the schools, the plays, the concerts, the education, the learning, the determination, the passion, so that people would always know that even in the face of the horrors, life continued and learning continued and love continued, and all the way through the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And we're talking about things, and I always remind people that let's avoid the lachrymose view of Jewish history. That's kind of a fancy word for sort of a dire view of Jewish history. The great professor Salo Baron, who had the first chair in Jewish history in the United States at Columbia University, said, don't fall prey to the lachrymose view of Jewish history. Jewish history is glorious, full of wonderful tradition, religion, theology, history, sociology, you name it. Yes, indeed, there are sad stories of pogroms, persecution, the Holocaust, but we must remember that, of course, in the end, we all affirm life, and that's critically important. I'll tell you, based upon my work in 3 states, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, 225,000 square miles, our JCRC work is far more often characterized by friendship, partnership, as we have with the city of Edina, than the other. But of course, when we have to address the other, it's often very serious. And that's a final point I want to make here today, and I think the good mayor was making this point, and that is democracy above all else. And this is the exact moment in time when we have to defend our democracy. We see what's happened in Buffalo, the manifesto posted, the poisonous hatred of African Americans and Jews, others. It's there in black and white, so to speak, because there the killer sets out in very distinct terms what it is that should happen to Jews and to blacks and the like, and other minorities. And this is what we must guard against. This is what we should protect against. We must rally together in order to address these issues, because sadly, the use of violence against minorities, particularly from the white supremacist vein, has only grown over time. And we all know the awful, horrible acts that have occurred in the last few years. It's a dangerous time for democracy when people turn to violence to express their political views. This is corrosive of democracy. We are a robust, vibrant democracy approaching our 250th year, God willing. We're not Weimar democracy in Germany. Nevertheless, when you see people, and ever more people, at least willing to consider the possibility of the use of violence in connection with their political views, we all have to stand resolute in favor of a democracy and the rule of law. So let us keep that in mind, particularly on this day. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce Eva Mourinho, and I've had this pleasure 3 or 4 times over the last probably year or two, Eva, to introduce you and your wonderful personality and your sparkling view of life and the story that you tell and the way that you remember your parents and your family in the broader picture of the Holocaust. Eva, friends, grew up in Czechoslovakia, the former Czechoslovakia, as a child of 2 Holocaust survivor parents. She graduated from college in economics and escaped the communist regime and made her way to the United States and ultimately to Minnesota. She lives in Minneapolis. Husband, to 3 children and 6 grandchildren, Kenohora, as we say in Yiddish. She enjoys reading, yoga, traveling, baking, cooking, and I think just making people happy in their lives by the story that she relates and doing so many good things for our community. She's going to tell a deeply personal story of the Holocaust about her mom and how her mom survived in a camp as a prisoner, remembering the recipes that she made, remembering a better time as motivation to continue to live. And then she spread that motivation, she spread that inspiration to others. And soon they found themselves collecting recipes, literally the food of life, in order to enable them to survive. And at times writing those recipes on the backs of the paper, the very orders that were being used to try to torment them, to oppress them, in a sort of remarkable irony. And again, that point of resistance above all in affirming life. So that's the story that we're going to hear. I don't want to say any more because, of course, we want to hear from Eva and have Eva tell the story. But again, I thank everybody present today on this glorious, wonderful, beautiful Minnesota May Sunday afternoon. Thank you, Mayor, again. Thank you to all of our friends in Edina. And Eva, as ever, we're here to hear your story.
Thank you so much, Steve, for your kind introduction. And I want to thank to the Human Rights and Relations Commission and to the City of Edina for inviting me to speak. I'm honored to be here with you today and to share with you the story of my parents. As Steve mentioned, I was born in former Czechoslovakia, as a child to 2 Holocaust survivor parents. I grew up without grandparents and only knew them through the stories that my parents told me. I knew that I was different because all my friends had grandparents and they had a large family, and I did not. So I began to ask my parents questions at a young age, and my parents gave me simple answers when I was young, so as not to scare me. But my questions were always answered truthfully and age appropriately. They never dismissed me or silenced me. And I'm going to share with you my presentation now. So initially, the story of my parents was intended to be a family history book, only for my children and grandchildren. But today, there is such a shocking rise in hatred and anti-Semitism, and Holocaust denial and distortion of history are frequent occurrences. So as a second generation of Holocaust survivors, I felt that it is not only my responsibility, but it is my obligation to go public with the story of my parents in hope to educate the younger generation who knows very little about the Holocaust. The Holocaust started with hateful words, and it ended with the genocide of the European Jews. The hidden recipe, the story of my parents, it is a story of my parents, Elena and Ernest, but in the book I refer to them as Itza and Ernő, as this is how they were called by family and friends. And both my parents were born in Austria-Hungary. And here you can see on the left side, on their honeymoon in 1947, and then 50 years later in the United States. So they were born in Austria-Hungary, but they didn't know each other before the war. My father was married, and he and his first wife had a little daughter, Marika. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed at the end of World War I, and the first Czechoslovak Republic was established, was founded in 1918. The president, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, was a wonderful president, and he respected the rights of all the citizens, their religious, their economic rights. So everybody had a good life, and the government protected the Jews from anti-Semitism. My mother, Itza, had a happy childhood and they had a comfortable life. Her father, my grandfather, my Kellner grandfather, owned a textile store, and he was a very kind and caring person. They were people just like you and me. They lived normal lives. My grandfather, who owned a textile store, he often gave out merchandise for free. If somebody didn't have money to pay for a few meters of fabric, or my grandfather also sold coffins for funerals. If somebody had a death in the family and could not pay for it, my grandfather would say, take it, and when you can pay, you can come back and pay for it. My paternal grandmother always made extra food every Shabbat, before every Shabbat, and would send food to the people who were less fortunate. So they were very kind, good people. Itza's parents, my mother Itza, her parents hired a German governess for her. They wanted her to learn German. They spoke German, Hungarian, and then later they learned Czechoslovak. So they wanted her to learn German, which may have saved her life later on. Itza was an only child until age 15, when her sister Vera was born, but family and friends called her Babi. So this is my mother and my aunt. There was a big age difference between them. When Itza was older, her parents sent her to a German school in Brno. Brno was a city in Czechoslovakia. So she spoke fluent German, and when she finished school and returned back home, she became a kindergarten teacher. Unfortunately, the peaceful and prosperous life in Czechoslovakia did not last long. Czechoslovakia became Hitler's target for annexations. And if you look at on the blue color, northern and western and a little bit of southern region of Czechoslovakia, currently the Czech Republic. This was called the Sudetenland, with the German Bohemian population. This region was ceded to Germany in 1938. A small part on the it's like a hot pink color north was ceded to Poland, and like 1 month later the first Vienna Award was signed. That was end of November or beginning of November 1938. The green region where which is the south of Slovakia today, the southern region, where my families lived, both my mother's and my father's families lived. This one was forced to cede to Hungary. So my parents, from one day to the next, they were no longer Czechoslovak citizens, but became citizens of Hungary. Life was very difficult. There were anti-Jewish laws passed. Every day they came up with new laws, and children could not attend school, people could not own businesses, and therefore livelihood was very difficult. There was no access to, if anyone had any savings in the bank, they had no access to the money in the bank, or could not go to the doctors, or could not go and shop in stores anymore. There were curfews. So, and Jewish people were also excluded from many professions. So life was very difficult. And now that they were no longer Czechoslovak, my father, Ernest, or Ernő in Hungarian, he was dismissed from the Czechoslovak army. And together with all the Jewish men who were capable of work, they were required to serve in the mandatory Hungarian forced labor service. So all the Hungarian Jews had to serve in those forced labor. And they served unarmed because, according to the Hungarians, they were unreliable to carry arms. And they did strenuous work under very harsh and brutal conditions. They had to dig trenches and build bridges and often carry big stones out of the rivers and all kinds of heavy work. They were guarded by the Hungarian Nyilas, the anti-Semitic fascist Arrow Cross troops. My father Ernő survived only because he escaped with the help of the righteous Gentiles. There were righteous Gentiles, but sadly not enough. There were many collaborators, and often even their neighbors who they lived next to, there were collaborators. My father escaped the forced labor because a complete stranger walked up to him one day when they were at a rest, during a rest period. And the stranger told him, "Why don't you run away up to the mountain? There is a stable with horses, and there will be somebody who can help you." And he did. During the night, he ran up the mountain and hid in the stable where there were already a few other Jewish people who escaped. They were hiding there. And families who owned this stable, they would bring food to them every day, and there was another home, and that family also helped. So these people were upstanders. They were not bystanders. And even one person can make a difference. And this is a lesson for all of us to learn, that if we see something, we must speak up, and we cannot be bystanders. And we must help. We must help others, regardless of their color, of their religion, of their sexual orientation. We must all be upstanders. So Hungary during World War II was allied with Germany, and in summer of 1941, Hungary, together with Germany and all the Axis powers, they invaded Soviet Union. And Germany was defeated at Stalingrad. The battle was very fierce there. And Hungary's losses were substantial, so in secret, they tried to back out of the alliance with Germany. But Hitler found out, and of course this was not acceptable to Hitler, and I'm going to stop sharing. Excuse me 1 second. Stop sharing, and then we will come back again. So this was not acceptable to Hitler, and the German troops invaded Hungary. It was March 19, 1944. Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest because he was in charge of deportations of the Hungarian Jews, which was the largest remaining Jewish population in Central Europe. And even Eichmann was surprised to see how enthusiastically the Hungarians collaborated with him. My mother was 31 years old and still single. Her sister Babi was only 16 years old when the deportation of the Hungarian Jews began in spring 44. And Itza, Babi, together with their parents and all the Jewish residents were arrested in May 1944. They were ordered to leave their homes and most of their possessions, and they were forced to move into a ghetto. A ghetto was they sectioned off a few homes, and once the people were in the ghetto, they could not leave anymore. And the local residents could not wait to take their possessions. In the ghetto, they lived in crowded conditions. The Jews were brought in from all the surrounding regions, including from the town where my father's family lived. His wife, Irenka, and his daughter, Marika, who was 3 years old, and his parents and other family members, they were all brought to the same ghetto where my mother and her family was. And they were there for about 5 weeks. And after 5 weeks, the ghetto was liquidated, and they were herded into cattle trains, not knowing where they are being taken. They were told that they are going to work. The cattle trains were very crowded, and the journey took 3 days. They were not given food or water during this period. And Itza remembered that she was standing, unable to move or sit down. There was no space, and they were unable to sleep throughout those 3 days. And since it was summer, it was very hot and stuffy. The cattle trains, these wagons, were windowless. There were no windows. There was just a little slit of opening. And it was stuffy, and they had hard time breathing, and people were dehydrated, and they were weak from hunger. And by the time they arrived to their destination, there were many dead among them. Finally, the cattle train came to a stop, and the doors were thrown open. The daylight was blinding after being locked up for 3 days. They were forcefully herded out on the nearby platform, and Itza never forgot her first impression when she stepped off the train. It was such an eerie feeling to see a vast area. There was no grass, no trees. There was heavy smoke coming out of the chimneys, and there was a terrible stench in the air. They arrived at Auschwitz, also known as Auschwitz II or Birkenau, the largest of the Nazi concentration and death camps located in Poland. They never heard of Auschwitz before. Auschwitz was the final destination for many of them. It was middle of June 1944, and the Nazis on the train platform were with vicious dogs. The dogs were barking, and there were electric wire, barbed wire all around. The men were immediately separated from the women, and Itza's father did not have time to even say goodbye. He just turned back looking at his family with very sad eyes, and he was taken away immediately. The women were ordered to form a line, and when they approached the notorious SS physician, Josef Mengele, who was nicknamed Angel of Death because he conducted inhuman medical experiments, he pointed to Itza's mother to the left and Itza and Bobby to the right. This was the last time that the two sisters saw their parents. The elderly people and the young children and mothers with young children, they were all sent to the left. they were told that they would take a shower and they will rest after shower. But once they went into this large room with the shower heads, and the doors were heavy doors were locked, instead of water, they dropped Cyclone B from a very small opening on the top, and people suffocated within 10-15 minutes. And once they were gassed, the bodies were put into ovens and burned. And this was that terrible stench that they smelled when they arrived. The Nazis lied and deceived people from day one about everything. That day, Itza turned to a Jewish prisoner who was wearing a striped uniform and said, "Please tell us, where did they take our parents?" And he pointed to the smoking chimney and he said, "Do you see that chimney up there? That is where your parents are." So the same day, the day of their arrival, Itza and Bobby found out their parents were already murdered. They were no longer alive. The mass deportations of nearly 430,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz took place between May 15 and July 9, 1944, just within approximately 7 weeks. And half of the Jews killed, almost half of the Jews who were killed in Auschwitz were Hungarian Jews. 90% of the Hungarian Jews who arrived to Auschwitz were exterminated. And among them were my 4 grandparents, my father's first wife, and his little daughter, Marika, and the rest of many other family members. And I'm going to go back and share with you, just show you the PowerPoint presentation once again. This was my father's little daughter, Marika, when she was a baby. Now, my parents, everything was stolen. They didn't have one family picture. So they were somehow able to get this one photo of Marika. And this is my family. On the left side, over here, the very left top, are my maternal grandparents. And on the right, next to my grandparents in a shawl is my mother. And between my grandparents is my mother's sister, Bobby. These are my paternal grandparents. All 4 grandparents were murdered. On the right is my uncle Alex, who was in a forced labor also, and his family who were also murdered, his wife and 2 sons who were gassed in Auschwitz. And this is again my father's daughter, Marika, during the war. When she was murdered, she was 3 years old. These are my 2 cousins, Virka and Adi, they called him. And their parents were in hiding in the mountains because they were in the Slovak part of Czechoslovakia, in Slovakia. They were hiding, thinking that the kids will be safer with my grandparents in Hungary, who were now Hungarian. They were all taken to the gas chambers. And this is my father's youngest brother, Dönci in Hungarian, or Edmund in English. And he was taken to the Russian front with over 40,000 young Jewish men. And they were ordered by the Hungarian army to clear the minefields with their bare hands while the battle was raging. So they were right between the Soviet and the Axis powers. He was only 22 years old when he died. My father never knew how his young brother died. What was the cause? Was he cruelly treated by the Hungarians who were in charge? Or did he starve? Did he freeze because the winter was so brutal? Or was he overcome by a disease, or perhaps blown up while picking up the field mines? He never knew how, but most of them died. Very few returned. Itza and Bobby were spared, at least temporarily, in Auschwitz. They were ordered to strip naked, and they were sent to showers to take a shower. This time it was a real shower, just for like a minute, and then they were chased out with Nazis with a whip out of they just barely got wet, and then they were sprayed with a disinfectant that burned, and their hair was shaved off, completely shaved off, everywhere on their body, and then they were given one piece of ragged worn clothes from a big pile of clothing, no undergarments, nothing. Itza was lucky that she got a pair of wooden shoes. Not everyone had shoes. And everything was done in such a hurry, and they were rushed. And in Auschwitz concentration camp, there was hunger, death, diseases, and brutality. There was so much brutality that Itza, my mother, shared with me. They were gassing people, and they wanted to speed up the process, so they would have trenches where they would shut people into those trenches and then cover with dirt. And Itza saw that dirt still moving because some of them didn't die yet. They were still alive. They were no longer registered. In Auschwitz, everyone was registered by receiving, being tattooed in the left arm. But these Hungarian women were no longer registered, except a few of them at the very beginning of deportation, because the registration system collapsed due to the overload of the arrival of the Hungarian Jews. So they were kept for temporary work, but my mother and my aunt did not get any work in Auschwitz. Most of the time they spent by standing at cell appel roll calls from early morning. So they would wake them up at 4:30 a.m. and rush them out to stand at cell appel. And they would stand for hours, and they were hungry and tired and cold. And again, during the day, they had to stand for a few hours at roll calls. During roll calls, these hundreds and hundreds of women were counted. And if the count was off, even by one number, then they would begin counting all over again. And it was also a form of punishment. So during the day, when they were standing, the sun, this was now summer, the sun was shining on their bald heads, and many women got sunstroke, and many of them collapsed, and then they were just shot. Food was scarce in Auschwitz, and people were starving. Hunger was a big problem, and many people died of starvation. The rations were very small, intentionally very small, and these rations could barely keep them alive. Itza said that in the morning they would get little coffee, and it was more like brown water. During the noontime, they had soup, but often there were weeds in the soup. If somebody found a potato peel, just the peel of a potato, that person was very lucky on that day. In the evening, they got a small piece of bread, and my mother always showed me she said the bread was the size of the palm of my hand. And she said every day when she got this small piece of bread, she would divide it into 3 pieces and save some for later. In the evenings, in their barracks, the women would huddle together and talk about food. Imagination was a very important tool, and they remember the family meals back at home. These women substituted real food with the memory of food. Meanwhile, selections were going on all the time, daily, and there were selections from the train. As the train was arriving, people were selected and taken to the gas chambers, but also from the barracks. And Itza and Bobby saw some of their friends being selected, taken away. And also during the roll calls, people were selected to go to the gas chambers. So these women didn't know from 1 minute to the next when it will be their turn. The day arrived when Itza and Bobby were among the women selected to go to the gas chambers. They stood there all day and all night. On that day, the Nazis ran out of the gas Cyclone B. In the morning, this was now August 1944, an order was received from Germany that they are requesting Jewish slave workers. 1,000 Hungarian women, among them Itza and Bobby and all the rest of the women who stood in front of the gas chambers, were put on cattle trains and were transported to Germany, to the Hesse region, and taken to the underground munition factory in Hessisch-Lichtenau, which was a sub-camp of Buchenwald concentration camp. It was one of the largest munition factories, not only in Germany, but in entire Europe. When these emaciated women arrived in the town of Hessisch-Lichtenau, a suburb of Hirschhagen in Germany, the commandant of the camp was shocked to see what condition they were, because they were just like skin and bone. And the commandant turned to the SS guards and said, "I asked for workers. You brought me skeletons." But already at this time, summer of 44, there was labor shortage in Germany, so they accepted the women. And this is where they were registered for the very first time. So the SS guards took them to the edge of the town, 1.5 hour walking distance, and the women were registered first. They received a small piece of cotton rag that was hand-stamped with a number and stitched on the front of their whatever ragged piece of clothes they wore. And my mother Itza became prisoner number 20409, and her sister Bobby was 20407. On the right side, you can see a little tie that she found on it was on her wooden clog that she got in Auschwitz, and she saw that this tie was maybe cut out from a mezuzah, and she decided to save it. On the left, or my left, I should show you here, this is a round identification pin, and this was given to my mother only, and I will explain to you why. And if you can see, it says Fabrik Hessisch-Lichtenau. Fabrik is shortened to Fab, F-A-B-R, Hessisch shortened to Hess, and then Lichtenau. So Itza, my mother, got this ID pin for a reason, and she kept it. She kept everything. The work in the munition factory was physically demanding for these malnourished women. Filling grenades and mines and bombs was very toxic, and it was dangerous. These were toxic materials. It was dangerous to inhale. And some of the women developed liver poisoning. Eva said that their skin turned yellow, and some of them died because of poisoning from these toxic fumes. And first of all, I want to show you, this is just a prisoner identification card, just to show you how the Germans they kept precise records. If you look at this table on the bottom, you can see Dieter Vaupel. He is a German teacher who wrote a book in the 70s or the 80s, I believe in the 80s. He wrote a book, he did a research on this transport of 1,000 Hungarian women from Auschwitz to Hesse-Lichtenau, the transport that Itza and Bobby, my mother and my aunt, were in. And if you look at the very top line, the date is reversed, August 2, 1944. 1,000 women from Auschwitz were taken to Hesse-Lichtenau. The table on the top says arrivals and departures in Hesse-Lichtenau. So 1,000 women arrived on August 2. The second line, there is the name under Auschwitz, Eva Fisher. Eva Fisher was my mother's and my aunt's good friend. She suffocated just within a couple days, suffocated from these toxic materials that they used. If you look down, the one before the last line, it says October 27, 1944. 206 women were sent back to Auschwitz because they could not keep up. Some got sick, some could not keep up with the work, and they were sent back to Auschwitz and straight into the gas chambers. So Bobby's assignment was to load the heavy explosives into a wheelbarrow and transport it to another and unload it on another table. And this was very strenuous work for her. She was 16 years old, petite, only 5 feet tall. She was malnourished, only skin and bone. And it was very difficult for her. And I would like to read an excerpt to you. So, on these daily marches back to the barracks from the factories, Bobby would plead with Itza, "Leave me alone already. I can't bear this anymore. Let me die." After losing her dear parents, Itza had only her sister. She was fortunate to stay with her sister throughout the captivity. There was someone she loved and who loved her, someone beside herself to live for, and for whom it was necessary to remain strong. She felt responsible for her sister, and she always encouraged her sister not to give up. The SS guards and the capo were supervising the prisoners. The SS guards and the capo treated them with extreme brutality, and anything minor would provoke the most vicious beatings. One day, Itza overheard a conversation between 2 capos who were discussing that they needed help in the kitchen to peel potatoes. Immediately, she thought of her sister, and she politely approached the women with her request. The capos asked her why she wanted her sister to get this job, and she explained that the factory work was very difficult for Bobby. That day, when the long shift in the factory ended and they were lined up ready to march back to the barracks, all of a sudden, 4 SS women, who were often even more brutal than the SS men, started to hit Itza. They beat her, mostly hitting her head. And Itza kept asking them, warum? Why? But they could not tell her why. Only later she found out that she was beaten because she had asked the two couples if they could assign the kitchen duty to her sister. The couples complained about her to the SS guards. Both sisters were in tears. Bobby was very upset and said to her sister, "You are suffering even more because of me. Why did you interfere? At the end, I did not get the job anyway, and they hurt you." Itza saw how terribly swollen her sister's legs were and how difficult it was for her to work in the heavy ammunition factory. It was painful to see her little sister suffer so much. Walking a few kilometers every day from the barracks to the factory and back in the evenings was difficult for all these weak and malnourished women. In the evening, they returned from the factory back to the camp. They were ordered to stand for Zell-Appell and were counted. Unbeknownst to Itza, the SS women guards complained about her to the camp commandant. Before the women were allowed to enter the barrack, the commandant stepped out of his office, unlocked the electric wire gate, and pointed to Itza. "Du Kleine, komm in mein Büro. You little one, come to my office," ordering her to follow him. Itza looked back at her sister and cousins. It was a silent farewell. She followed the commandant until she disappeared behind the electric wire gate and into the building. They heard rumors that anyone who is summoned to the commandant's office does not come out alive. The commandant and Itza entered his office. She was standing, and he leaned with his back against the desk. He began to question her while fingering his pistol. "Do you know what you deserve?" he asked. "Yes, I know, Herr Commandant. And you will do me a favor if you shoot me, because I cannot take this life any longer," Itza replied calmly. He looked at her, surprised. "Whose daughter are you that you speak such beautiful German?" he asked her. "My father is a business owner," she responded. He thought for a moment and then said, "Come." Itza, determined to remain brave, followed him silently, not knowing if she would be taken to the electric wire fence or shot. To her surprise, the commandant opened the electric wire gate and told her to return to the barrack. When she entered the barrack, she saw her sister, cousins, and friends huddled together and crying. They were all shocked to see her alive. Over the years, whenever Itza thought of this incident, she wondered why the commandant let her live. Was it because he did not want to do a favor to her and spare her more suffering? Or was it because he was impressed by her knowledge of German? Perhaps it was both, but she never knew the answer. Itza's assignment, because she was fluent in German, and she spoke with a Hochdeutsch, High German dialect, she was selected by the Nazis to be a translator and a messenger. And she was told, if she does not have any translation to do or take messages throughout the large munition factory, then she should clean the factory. And this is why she got that round identification, that ID pin, that was assigned to her because she had to go through the premises, carry messages from building to another building. So she had this ID pin. In Hesse-Schlichtenau, they continued to get very small rations and they were starving. And among the hunger and starvation and suffering, diseases and bitter cold and death all around them, in the evenings, back in the barracks, they would talk about their favorite foods and they would share recipes with each other. The memory of the pre-war life was a powerful survival tool, and talking about food was essential because it gave them hope. So my mother wanted very much to write down the recipes that the women shared with her, and the cleaning duties proved to be advantageous to her. One day, while she was cleaning the factory, she saw a big stack of paper in the garbage. And when nobody looked, she pilfered the stack of paper from the wastebasket. She also found a small little pencil. And the paper that she pilfered was German papers that carried information about the munition manufactured at Hesse-Schlichtenau, like bombs and grenades and mines, and used to annihilate the Jews during the Holocaust. And they were just thrown away. They were not used. So I would like to share with you a few of these recipes. And I just want to tell you that she had to hide these papers. So she had to be very careful not to be discovered with paper and pencil. So she quickly tore the seams of her ragged one-piece clothing, and she made it into a fabric pouch, and she put the papers into that pouch and the pencil and tied it on the inside of what she was wearing. Writing recipes was a form of indirect resistance. This was her way to defy the Nazis. And talking about food and writing down the recipes gave her hope and helped her to maintain her sense of dignity. The famous neurologist, psychiatrist, and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl wrote in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that everything, and I quote, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And there was so much taken away from these women, their parents, like from Itza and Babi, their parents, their families, their friends, all their possessions, their identity, their name. They became a number. Even their hair was taken from them. But the freedom to choose how to respond to the situation. And my mother began to write the recipes that the women shared. And every day she wrote a few recipes. And she wrote hundreds of recipes, all in Hungarian, often put the name of the person on the recipe, the name of the person that shared the recipe with her. It's fascinating that the women built and maintained a whole social network under these most horrific conditions. Imagination was a very important and powerful tool. And in their mind, they substituted real food with memories of food. I selected a few papers that she pilfered. So this is a 5 centimeter light grenade launcher, and it was used in World War II. And Itza wrote mandula pudding, which means almond pudding. And next to the pudding, you see a name Pani. Pani, unfortunately, was among the 206 women who were sent back after 2 months back to Auschwitz from Hesse-Lichtenau, together with her sister. Pani was there with her sister. So Pani was murdered in Auschwitz, but she gave a few recipes to Iza. The next one is Regal Mine 43. Regal Mine 43 is a German steel-cased anti-tank mine used also in World War II. And Iza wrote vanilla cream for Napoleon pastry. And under the 43, the number 43, you can see she wrote Dr. Gershny, Krémes tölteléke. This is a Hungarian way to say Mrs. Gersh, wife of Dr. Gersh, who gave her this recipe. The next one is SD-50. SD-50 was a thick-walled explosive bomb, fragmentation bomb, which was used by Luftwaffe during World War II. This was given to her. She wrote darázsfészek, which is the exact translation, wasp nest, because the dough is put into the pan, looks like a nest of wasp. It's a yeast dough given to her by Piri. Piri survived Auschwitz. She survived Hesse-Lichtenau munition factory, forced labor, and she was shot during the death march. And I will tell you the story shortly. And this is a recipe from Piri. The next one, this is an admission ticket, and you see the town where the munition factory was, Hesse-Lichtenau. This was an admission ticket, a high Nazi official, if they came to visit or to a meeting, they had to fill out this form, their name, the date, and they had to sign it. And Iza wrote on the other side of the form, of the paper, she wrote chestnut roulade, given to her by Irene. SC 250. This was also a general purpose high explosive bomb. This bomb was also used by Luftwaffe, and this bomb weighed 550 pounds. She wrote a recipe for fig and nut slices, given to her by Mariška. And this one is another piece of paper that was thrown away. SC-50 was also a bomb, a general purpose bomb used by Luftwaffe. And she wrote the recipe for McDonald's cookies. And on the very bottom of the recipe, she wrote Dr. Jámborné Ethel. So that was Ethel Jámbor, wife of Dr. Jámbor, from Zalaegerszeg in Hungary, who shared the recipe with my mother. And the last one that I will share with you is sweet dumplings with farmer cheese, shared by Mariška, that was written on an entrance ticket. I'm going to go back and stop here for a minute and tell you that it was now spring 1945, and the Allied troops were approaching, and they could hear gunfire. And Hitler gave orders to gas all the remaining Jews. So the Nazis decided to evacuate Hesse-Lichtenau munition factory, the sub-camp of Buchenwald concentration camp. And they decided that they will take the women to Theresienstadt concentration camp in Terezin, currently Czech Republic, that time it was Czechoslovakia. And apparently there was one functioning gas chamber. So Hesse-Lichtenau was evacuated in March 1945. The women were put on cattle trains again, with the intention to take them to Theresienstadt. But the Allies were getting closer and closer, and the train was making stops over a few days and couldn't keep going. They were making numerous stops because of the bombings. And finally, they got off in Leipzig. They took the women off the train, and they decided to take them by walk, by foot. And if I have 2 minutes to read an excerpt, I would love to read this for you. Just very quickly, another excerpt from the book, What Happened During the Death March. So in Leipzig, they stayed overnight in a vacant Hitler Youth building. And the Allies did not know that the building had been evacuated by the Nazis and was instead being occupied by the women. And consequently, the Allies started to bomb it during the night. As the Allies shot phosphorus and dropped magnesium flare bombs to illuminate the building, and they started to fly lower with their airplanes, they were surprised to see women running out of the building. Immediately they stopped the bombing, but part of the building was already in flames. A few women died, but the majority of them escaped by running out of the building in the middle of the night. Itza ran outside with the others, but then realized she had forgotten the pouch with the recipes inside the building. My recipes! I forgot my recipes! She turned around and ran back to rescue her precious recipe collection. Her sister and others cried out to her, Itza, what are you doing? Don't go back inside. But she did not listen, exclaiming to them, I have to get my recipes. And she ran back into the burning building. The Nazis walked with them day and night. There were no more daily rations of food, and people were dying of starvation, and they were exhausted, and whoever could not keep up with them, was staying behind, they were immediately shot. So food was very scarce. So occasionally the Nazis stopped at the farm and asked the farmer to give them some food. And I showed you the recipe of wasp nest, or not the recipe, but the paper, the German paper recipe of wasp nest was shared by Piri. Piri she survived Auschwitz, as I mentioned before, and survived the slave labor. And during this death march, when they stopped at the farm, and on this particular farm, the farmer agreed to boil potatoes for the women, Piri could not wait any longer. She was so hungry. She ran up to the pot of boiling water and grabbed a potato, and the Nazi immediately shot her. She fell by the feet of the women. She died only days before being liberated. But as the Allied troops were getting closer, the Nazis feared for their lives, and they started to run away. And one day, the women found themselves all alone, without the SS guards. And on this day, the death march that began 2 weeks before came to an end in Wurzen, 26 kilometers from Leipzig. So the women dispersed, they formed small groups, and they began to walk toward their border of their country. So to the border of Czechoslovakia. There was no transportation. Germany was heavily bombed. So they walked, and as they walked, suddenly they saw an American jeep approach near Riesa or Dahlen in Germany, and the women were overjoyed. And 4 American soldiers came the jeep came to a stop and 4 American soldiers stepped out. They took the women back to Warsaw, and that's where they were liberated in April 1945. Some of the women who shared their beloved recipes with my mother did not survive, and those who did are no longer alive. But the stories and the recipes will live on for many generations to come. And I just want to share just a few images with you. My mother's sister, Bobby, my aunt Bobby, who came to visit us in the United States. My mother and I, all the torts and the pastries that you see on this photo, my mother baked them. She made them. This was for a bar mitzvah of one of our sons. And the book Hidden Recipes is a memoir, story of my parents, but I decided to translate 6 of my most favorite recipes shared by my mother. I translated it into English. And I will start 12 o'clock on the top. These are the Linzer cookies. 1 o'clock, the Ischler cookies. Below that is the almond tort. Bottom middle, chocolate cover, the chocolate on the top, the chocolate icing is a very famous gerbo slices. And there is a famous patisserie, a pastry shop in Budapest called Gerbo, and this is one of their signature cakes, and next to it the sour cherry cake. And I mentioned to you that Piri was shot just days before during the death march. This is the wasp nest. This is why it's called the wasp nest, and this is just a piece of wasp nest that is filled with walnuts and sugar and cinnamon. My mother at age 90. My family, we are blessed with 6 grandchildren. And yes, our grandchildren are helping me to bake. We continue baking and making all these recipes that were shared that my mother shared with us. 6 million European Jews were murdered in the Holocaust by Nazi Germany and their collaborators. Jews were the primary victims of the Holocaust, but there were many other victims. The horrors of the Holocaust were the result of hatred, and we all must learn from it and must always remember and tell these stories. Kindness and compassion must win over hatred. And as the famous Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, and he was a Nobel laureate, said, "To remain silent and indifferent is the greatest sin of all." And I'm going to stop sharing with you. Sorry. My finger, stop sharing. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Mourinho, for sharing your story. As of now, we're going to transition into a bit of a Q&A period. If any viewers watching are interested in asking Mrs. Mourinho more about her story, please comment on Facebook Live or directly email Heidi Lee. As of now, I'll ask you a couple prepared questions. So the first one is, what can other generations of Holocaust survivors do to keep the stories alive, besides what your mother did?
It is very important to share the story, to record them, to record the stories and share them, to keep these stories alive. It must continue. The stories must never be forgotten. And there are so many lessons that we can learn from the Holocaust survivors. For example, to be hopeful, never lose hope. Those who lost hope, they died. So there are many lessons: to be positive, to be hopeful, adapt to the circumstances if there is nothing you can do to change it. So I would say, record the stories, ask questions, and share them.
Of course. The next question is, what advice do you have on getting started and finishing the project for anyone of any faith wanting to capture their family history for their children and grandchildren?
I would say the same thing. I would say, first of all, no matter how life is busy, because everybody's life is busy, make time for sitting down with your loved one, ask questions. Don't wait, because you never know how much time you have. So ask questions, record them, and I have regrets. I actually am one of the very fortunate, one of few second generation who my parents talk to me and share their lessons. But I have regrets. When I started to write the book, I published end of 2019. There were so many questions that I wanted to ask that I never thought of before. So ask questions and keep writing them down and record them, video recording, anything. It's very, very important.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question we have is, looking at current events, how do we bear witness to all the terrible acts of violence due to hatred?
It's terribly, terribly upsetting, troubling what is happening in Ukraine and many parts of the world. And I think that we must be there for others who are suffering. We must help in whatever way we can help. We send money. Some people help other ways, but we must help people who are less fortunate, who are going through tough times, and we have to support them in any way we can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question is, what do you hope people learn and do after the story of your parents, after they have learned of the story of how your parents survived the Holocaust?
My hope is that people will learn how important it is to always treat others kindly and respectfully. And my parents were very kind people, and their heart was open, their home and their heart was open to people from all walks of life. And to me, I think what is the most important, just to be kind, to be respectful, as I said. And as I said before, to be an upstander, not a bystander. When you see something in school or in workplace or anywhere in life, speak up. Speak up and you know that one person can make a difference. And also, I would like to say that, remember, we have such an inner strength, and that we don't even realize. So going through some tough situation, we can tap into our inner strengths. And yes, we can get through tough times. But the most important thing is be kind.
Thank you. And for the last question, throughout your story today, you have referenced finding joy. How and where do you find joy these days?
So the pandemic and the news often is very stressful. And my joy comes from my family. I have our 3 children with their significant others and our 6 grandchildren. They come for dinners. And during the pandemic, during the summer, we have to eat outdoors. But to me, that's the highlight, having, gathering with my family, connecting with my friends. Music to me is a distressor, is very, very important in my life. Books, reading books, nature, and for me, yoga. So these are the things that I find. And of course, I have a very supportive and kind husband, and we are there for one another.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Moureiimi.
You're welcome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Francesca. That was great. And thank you as well, Mrs. Moureiimi. That was so inspiring. And the ending was so uplifting after hearing all that your family went through. I want to just close here by thanking Mayor Hoblin for your inspiring words and for Steve Hunnigs for your ongoing wisdom, your time and support that you have contributed to the Human Rights and Relations Commission for all these years. I also want to thank Heidi Lee. Heidi is our city liaison and all of your assistance with everything that we do. The event would also not be possible without my co-chair, Jasmine Stringer-Moore. She works tirelessly for the Human Rights and Relations Commission, as well as our two student commissioners, Sabi Mirza and Francesca Lichtenberger, who even contributed today, but they contribute to everything that we do. And finally, I want to thank you, Eva, for such an inspirational presentation that sadly, it's probably as pertinent today as it was 80 years ago when all of this occurred. But thank you for having the courage to educate us on your story. It truly is incredible. And those hidden recipes put everything into perspective with what they did to make sure that they had something to bring with them through that all. Yeah, we will never forget, thanks to people like you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us today for our 11th annual Days of Remembrance. Again, for more information about the Human Rights and Relations Commission or the city of Edina in general, please go to the city's website. And this concludes our program today. So thank you all again for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.